January 1943. The Eastern Front. Low cloud presses down on a frozen landscape scarred by tracks and shell craters. Snow drifts across abandoned roads where steel has burned black into the ground at barely 50 meters above the earth. An aircraft pushes forward slowly, heavy, and deliberately, its engine strain in the cold air inside the cockpit. The pilot sees everything. Too much, perhaps. Individual trees. Gun flashes. The dark shapes of Soviet tanks spread across the white plain. This is not a fighter's altitude. There is no room for speed or escape. Every second spent here invites rifle fire, machine guns, and anti-aircraft bursts rising from the ground. The aircraft does not dive. It does not climb. It lines up, then the gun fires. The recoil shakes the entire airframe. Shells slam downward, not in a wide spray, but with brutal intent aimed at armor, engines, crews. For a brief moment, the aircraft fulfills its purpose. A tank halts, smoke rises, but the sky offers no protection. The return fire is immediate. This machine was never meant to dominate the air. It was built to survive long enough to kill on the ground, and its existence raises a question that leads directly back to the war that demanded it. September 1039. Shemini's war begins with speed. Columns of tanks punch through Poland while aircraft roar overhead, striking bridges, rail yards, and retreating troops. The coordination between ground and air appears seamless. To outside observers, the German way of war seems complete. Armor breaks the front, aircraft paralyze the rear, victory follows quickly. But beneath this success lies an assumption that will not survive the next 2 years. German planners enter the war believing that enemy armor can be suppressed from the air through shock, disruption, and morale collapse. The Ru-87 Stuka dive bomber became the symbol of this belief. Its siren, its steep dive, and its precision strikes terrify infantry and shatter fixed positions. Against lightly armored vehicles, it works well enough. Against early tanks, it can still achieve results by luck, angle, or repeated attack. Yet tanks are changing. By 1940, during the campaign in France, German crews began to notice a problem. Allied armor is thicker. Hits that would once disable a vehicle now only scar paint or bend plates. The Stuka can destroy bridges and supply columns, but a tank in motion is a different target. It is small, mobile, and increasingly resistant to blast damage. Germany advances anyway. France collapses. The issue is noted, filed, and postponed. Then, in June 1941, Germany turned east. Operation Barbarossa opens with the same confidence. Once again, armored spearheads surge forward under Luftwaffe cover. But within days, German units encounter vehicles they did not expect in such numbers. Soviet T-34s and KV-1s south appeared from forests and villages, shrugging off anti-tank fire that had been sufficient in the west. From the air, the problem becomes stark. Standard bombs are inefficient against tanks. Near misses may stun crews or damage tracks, but direct hits are rare. Fighters armed with machine guns can harass soft targets, not armored ones. Dive bombers are too slow and too exposed when operating repeatedly over the same battlefield. The Luftwaffe adapts in the field. Crews experiment with low-level attacks, dropping bombs at shallow angles or fitting aircraft with heavier cannon pods. The results are inconsistent. Aircraft suffer losses to ground fire. Pilots report difficulty identifying targets amid smoke and dust. Ammunition is expended quickly for uncertain effect. Meanwhile, the Red Army is not collapsing as expected. Soviet production accelerates east of the Urals. Tank numbers increase, not decrease. By late 1941, German ground forces were no longer just advancing. They were reacting, countering, and desperately holding positions against armored thrusts. The German army turns to the Luftwaffe with growing urgency. The request is no longer for air superiority or battlefield disruption. It is specific and blunt. They need aircraft that can kill tanks, reliably, repeatedly, at the point of contact. This demand exposes a gap in German air doctrine. The Luftwaffe was built to support fast-moving offensives, not prolonged attritional battles against massed armor. Its aircraft are versatile, but none are truly specialized for the task now dominating the Eastern Front. What the situation demands is not speed or elegance, but endurance at low altitude, protection against ground fire, and a weapon powerful enough to pierce steel. And that realization forces German planners toward a solution that would challenge every assumption about how combat aircraft was supposed to fight. The idea did not begin in desperation. It began quietly, years before the Eastern Front revealed its full-scale dot. As early as 1937, elements within the German Air Ministry had explored the concept of a Schlagflugs, a battlefield attack aircraft designed not for speed or altitude, but for survival under fire. The memory of trench warfare from the First World War still lingered. Aircraft that flew low were vulnerable, but they were also precise. The question was whether protection could be engineered into the airframe itself. In 1938, the Reich issued a requirement that ran against prevailing aviation fashion. The aircraft was to be heavily armored around the cockpit and engines. It would operate at low altitude, absorb ground fire, and deliver accurate firepower against point targets. Speed was secondary. Maneuverability was a luxury. Henschel, a firm better known for locomotives and armored vehicles than sleek aircraft, took the requirement seriously. Where other manufacturers leaned toward modified fighters, Henschel approached the problem as an engineer would approach a machine tool. The result was the HS-129 from the beginning. It was conceived around its pilot. The cockpit was a steel-armored tub with plates up to 12 mm thick surrounding the front and sides. Bullet-resistant glass formed the windscreen. The intent was clear. Rifle and machine gun fire should not kill the man inside on the first pass. This protection came at a cost. The cockpit was cramped, claustrophobic, and difficult to access. Visibility was restricted by thick framing and narrow armored glass panels. The pilot sat isolated, surrounded by steel, flying almost blind compared to fighter pilots used to open canopies and wide views. Power presented another problem. Germany's most reliable engines were already allocated to fighters and bombers. The HS-129 was fitted with French-built Gnome 14M radial engines. Compact, underpowered, and never designed for heavy armored aircraft. On paper, they were sufficient. In practice, they left the aircraft slow, especially when fully loaded. Yet the design pressed forward. The wings were straight and strong, optimized for stability rather than agility. The landing gear was fixed and sturdy, suitable for rough forward airstrips close to the front. Every feature spoke of an aircraft intended to operate in the mud and chaos of ground war, not the clean air of high-altitude combat. Armament was the core of the concept. Early versions carried twin machine guns and 20 mm cannon in the nose, adequate against trucks and artillery positions, but marginal against tanks. Engineers anticipated this limitation. The aircraft was designed to accept heavier weapons as they became available, effectively turning the fuselage into a weapons platform. Testing revealed the central contradiction of the design. The HS-129 could survive hits that would destroy lighter aircraft, but its lack of power made it unforgiving to fly. Takeoffs were long. Climb rates were poor. Engine failure at low altitude often meant no chance of recovery still. By 1942, with the Eastern Front demanding solutions rather than perfection, the aircraft entered limited service. It was neither graceful nor admired. Fighter pilots dismissed it as a flying bunker. Bomber crews saw it as obsolete before it arrived. But the ground war did not care about reputation. As German forces faced increasingly dense Soviet armor, the Luftwaffe committed the HS-129 to the one role it had been built for: flying directly into the most dangerous airspace on the battlefield, and it would be judged not by theory or design drawings, but by what happened when steel met steel at close range. For the men who flew the HS-129, the war was seen through thick glass and narrow frames. The cockpit offered no comfort and little mercy. Entry required climbing over armor plates and lowering oneself into a steel box barely wider than the pilot's shoulders. Once sealed inside, movement was limited. The control column sat close to the chest. The sidewalls pressed inward. In winter, cold crept through metal. In summer, heat and engine fumes lingered. Visibility was the constant complaint. The armored windscreen reduced peripheral vision, forcing pilots to rely on head movement and instinct. Spotting a tank meant flying low, straight, and dangerously slow, often below 300 km/h while scanning a battlefield filled with smoke, camouflage, and deceptive shadows. There was no illusion of safety. Armor might stop rifle fire, but it could not make the aircraft invulnerable. Anti-aircraft guns, even light ones, were deadly at the altitudes the HS-129 had to fly. Pilots learned quickly that survival depended on discipline, short attack runs, minimal exposure, an immediate withdrawal after firing. Engine failure was feared more than enemy fighters. With limited power and poor climb performance, losing one engine at low altitude often meant a forced landing behind enemy lines. Many pilots did not survive long enough to become veterans, yet those who did spoke of a strange clarity. The mission was simple: fly low, aim carefully, fire once or twice, leave. There was no dogfighting, no heroics, just precision under pressure. That precision depended entirely on the weapon mounted beneath the nose. The Hs. 129 was not truly an aircraft with guns, it was a gun with wings. Early armament proved inadequate against Soviet tanks. The solution came in the form of the MK-1, and later the MK-100 330mm cannon, heavy, slow-firing weapons designed to penetrate armor rather than shred aircraft. Mounted centrally, firing along the aircraft's axis, the cannon delivered extraordinary recoil. When fired, the aircraft shuddered violently. Pilots reported momentary loss of aim after each shot. Accuracy required discipline and timing. Short bursts, fired at extremely close range, often under 400 meters. Penetration was possible, but conditional. Side and rear armor could be breached. Top armor, thinner by necessity, was the preferred target. Direct frontal attacks were avoided whenever possible. Ammunition was limited. Every shell mattered. Misses could not be afforded. Later variants experimented with even heavier weapons, including a 75mm cannon adapted from an anti-tank gun. The concept was audacious, a flying artillery piece. In practice, the weapon's weight further reduced performance, making the aircraft even more vulnerable. The weapon could kill tanks, but only if everything went right, which meant the way the aircraft was used mattered as much as what it carried. His 129 units operated close to the front, often from rough airstrips carved out of fields. Missions were short, frequent, and exhausting. Crews relied on forward observers and radio reports to locate enemy armor concentrations. Attacks were conducted at treetop height. The aircraft approached from the sun when possible, using terrain to mask movement. There was no dive in the traditional sense, only a shallow descent to line up the shot. Coordination was difficult. Smoke, dust, and the chaos of mobile warfare obscured targets. Soviet units learned quickly to disperse and conceal tanks near tree lines and villages. Unlike operations earlier in the war, there was little ceremony, no sirens, no dramatic dives. Just brief, violent contact and withdrawal. Losses were steady. The aircraft returned, riddled with holes. Some did not return at all. And all the while the enemy adapted, learning how to survive the very attacks. The Hs 129 was designed to deliver to Soviet tank crews. The Hs 129 was not seen as an aircraft in the traditional sense. It was heard first a low, heavy engine note close to the ground, followed by the unmistakable crack of cannon fire striking armor, early in its deployment. The aircraft achieved a measure of surprise. Soviet crews were accustomed to air attacks from higher altitudes, bombs falling, machine gun strafing, parsers, rockets fired in salvos. The Hs 129 was different. It approached deliberately, often from unexpected angles, and fired with precision. Reports from the front noted damaged tracks, punctured engine compartments, and immobilized vehicles rather than spectacular explosions. Tanks did not always burn. Sometimes they simply stopped, blocking roads and formations. For armored units advancing under pressure, this disruption mattered. But the Red Army learned quickly. By mid-1942, Soviet units increased the density of light anti-aircraft weapons accompanying tank formations. Heavy machine guns and 20mm cannons were repositioned to cover likely approach routes. Crews were trained to fire at low-flying aircraft without waiting for orders. Camouflage improved. Tanks were concealed near tree lines, buildings, and terrain folds. Movement was coordinated to reduce exposure during daylight hours when air attack was most likely. Crucially, Soviet doctrine did not rely on single vehicles. Losses were absorbed through numbers. Where one tank was disabled, others advanced. Hs 129 could hurt, but it could not stop an armored army alone. Within the Luftwaffe, opinions were divided. Some commanders praised the aircraft for finally giving ground forces a tool designed specifically for their needs. Others saw it as a symbol of compromise, a slow, vulnerable machine operating in an increasingly hostile sky. Industries struggled to keep pace. Production numbers remained limited, never reaching the scale required to influence the front decisively. Engine shortages persisted, spare parts were scarce. Pilots required specialized training that could not be accelerated. By 1943, Germany faced a strategic dilemma. Resources were stretched across fighters defending the Reich, bombers attempting to strike deep targets, and ground attack aircraft like the HS-129 absorbing steady losses. The aircraft did its job, but it demanded conditions Germany could no longer guarantee: airspace not completely dominated by enemy fighters, logistics capable of sustaining specialized units, and time to refine tactics. As the war shifted toward attrition, desperation grew. Expectations placed on the HS-129 increased beyond what any single aircraft could deliver, which led inevitably to the moment when theory, design, and battlefield reality would collide at full scale. The HS-129 represented a harsh calculation: protect the pilot with armor, accept the loss of speed, fly low enough to kill tanks, and accept that losses would still come. Every mission weighed steel against flesh. Aircraft could be replaced slowly. Trained pilots could not. Yet the demands of the front left little room for restraint. By committing the HS-129 to the most dangerous role in the war, German command implicitly accepted a level of attrition that reflected the larger shift of the conflict itself, and that shift would soon reach its most violent expression on a battlefield, where the outcome would decide whether the concept of a flying anti-tank gun had a future at all. The HS-129 did not enter the war in a single dramatic debut. It arrived in fragments, small detachments attached to larger formations, testing themselves against a front that offered no controlled conditions. By the summer of 1942, the aircraft was committed more fully to operations in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. German forces were driving toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Their supply lines stretched thin, their margins for error narrowing by the week. Soviet armor appeared everywhere, on roads, in open fields. Emerging from villages thought secure, his 129 units were tasked with immediate response. When armored concentrations were reported, they were sent forward with minimal delay. Often they arrived to find the battlefield already in motion, tanks advancing, infantry scattering, artillery firing, without pause. The aircraft's limitations became evident immediately. Takeoffs from rough airstrips were dangerous, especially in heat and dust. Fully loaded with ammunition and fuel, the HS-129 struggled to lift clear of the ground. Any mechanical issue during the climb was often fatal. Once airborne, the aircraft flew low to avoid detection by enemy fighters, but this brought it directly into the envelope of ground fire. Pilots described the approach as a corridor of noise, tracer rounds rising, shells bursting ahead, debris thrown into the air. Attacks had to be precise. There was no capacity for repeated passes. Ammunition ran out quickly. Fuel consumption was high at low altitude. When hits were achieved, the effect was undeniable. Tanks halted, columns broke formation, crews abandoned damaged vehicles under fire. But success came at a price. Losses mounted steadily. Aircraft returned with engines shot through, control surfaces shredded, armor plates dented and cracked. Some crews did not return at all. Reports from the front were cautious. The HS-129 could kill tanks. It could support ground units at critical moments. But it required protection, coordination, and favorable conditions to survive. As 1943 approached, the aircraft was no longer an experiment. It was a tool, imperfect, costly, and increasingly essential. And then, on the plains of central Russia, the war prepared to answer whether that tool was enough. July 1943. The land around Kursk is dry, open, and exposed. Rolling fields stretch 4 kilometers, broken only by shallow ridges, tree lines, and villages that have already been fought over once before. This is not terrain that forgives hesitation. It is a place built for armor and for the aircraft tasked with stopping it. Operation Citadel begins with careful planning and crushing expectations. The German command commits its remaining armored strength in a bid to regain the initiative. Thousands of tanks converge toward the salient. The Luftwaffe is ordered to clear the way. For the HS-1, this is the moment it was built for. His 129 squadrons are assigned to attack Soviet armored concentrations ahead of advancing German ground forces. Missions begin at first light and continue until fuel, ammunition, or aircraft are exhausted, pilots fly multiple sorties per day, often returning to rearm and refuel under artillery fire. The battlefield below is saturated with defenses. Soviet planners have anticipated the air threat. Anti-aircraft guns are deployed in depth, layered around tank formations and likely approach routes. Machine gun nests are positioned to cover open ground. Smoke is used to obscure movement. Tanks advance in dispersed formations, reducing the impact of localized losses. His 129 pilots adapt as best they can. Approaches are made at the lowest possible altitude, using terrain to mask movement. Attacks focus on flanks and rear armor. Cannon fire is limited to short, controlled bursts. Every second over the target increases the risk of destruction. Some attacks succeed. Field reports confirm damaged and destroyed tanks, particularly when aircraft operate in coordinated groups. Immobilized vehicles block advance routes. Crews abandon machines under pressure, but the scale of the battle overwhelms individual successes. For every tank disabled, others continue forward. Soviet losses are absorbed by depth and reserves. The density of ground fire grows heavier with each passing day. Attrition among Hs 1 to 9 units accelerates. The aircraft's limitations become impossible to ignore. Its speed leaves no margin for escape once detected. Its engines struggle under the weight of armor and weapons. Enemy fighters increasingly contest the airspace, forcing ground attack aircraft to operate under constant threat. Loss rates climb. Experienced pilots are lost. Replacement crews arrive with limited training, facing one of the most heavily defended battlefields of the war by mid-July. It is clear that the Hs 129, despite its purpose-built design, cannot decisively alter the outcome at Kursk. It can be disruptive, it can cause damage, it can delay. It cannot stop an armored army supported by layered defenses and overwhelming numbers. When the German offensive stalls and then collapses under Soviet counterattacks, the verdict is implicit. The concept of a flying anti-tank gun has reached its operational limit not because it failed to work, but because the battlefield has evolved faster than the machine. As the front begins to roll westward, the Luftwaffe is forced to confront what remains of the Hs 129 program and what must replace it. And in that reckoning, the aircraft's future is no longer measured in ambition, but in survivability. The end did not come with an announcement. It came with fewer aircraft on the flight line. After Kursk, the Eastern Front no longer offered the conditions the Hs 129 required to function. Air superiority was contested or lost. Soviet anti-aircraft coverage thickened. Fighter opposition increased. What had once been dangerous became unsustainable. Loss reports told the story clearly. Attrition outpaced production. Entire aircraft were written off not because they failed to destroy tanks, but because they could no longer survive the journey to the target and back. Spare parts became scarce. Engines, already underpowered, were pushed beyond their limits in a war of constant retreat. The Luftwaffe adapted not by refining the Hs 129 further, but by shifting doctrine. Attention turned to aircraft that could perform multiple roles under worsening conditions. The Focke-Wulf FW-190F and G variants emerged as replacements, not because they were better tank killers in theory, but because they could survive longer in practice. Faster, more agile, and powered by stronger engines, they offered pilots a chance to escape after attacking. The Hs 129, by contrast, had no escape built into its design. Production slowed, then effectively ceased. Units were consolidated or disbanded. Remaining aircraft were used sparingly, often relegated to secondary fronts or emergency defensive actions where no alternatives existed. By late 1944, the aircraft had largely vanished from operational reports. There was no ceremony, no final mission, is just an absence. Yet the disappearance of the Hs 129 did not mean its effort was meaningless. What it revealed through loss, adaptation, and hard-earned data would shape how air forces thought about ground attack for decades to come, and that legacy would become clearer once the war itself reached its conclusion. The Hs 129 did not survive the war in serviceable numbers, but its influence did not disappear with the aircraft itself. German post-war analyses were blunt. The concept of a heavily armored, slow ground attack aircraft was judged tactically sound but strategically vulnerable. Protection could keep a pilot alive against small arms fire, but it could not compensate for lack of speed, climb, or engine power once the enemy adapted, yet the central idea endured. The war had proven that air power could directly engage armored forces, not merely disrupt them, but physically disable them, if aircraft were designed with that purpose in mind. What failed was not the mission, but the balance between protection, firepower, and survivability. Other nations took note. Allied air forces, reviewing battlefield data, reached similar conclusions through different paths. The British and Americans leaned towards speed and flexibility rather than armor. Rocket-equipped fighter bombers and fast-attack aircraft proved more adaptable in fluid combat environments. Hits were less precise, but exposure time was shorter. The Soviets, fighting the same battlefield from the opposite side, pursued their own solution. The Il-2 heavily armored and produced in massive numbers, accepted high losses in exchange for relentless pressure. Quantity became a form of survivability. The Hs-129 sat between these approaches to specialize, to scarce, and to constrained by engine limitations to fully realize its potential. Still, its data informed later designs. The lessons of low attack, pilot protection, recoil management, and target acquisition became standard considerations. The idea that an aircraft could be built around a weapon, rather than adding weapons to an aircraft, would resurface in later decades under very different technological conditions. By the end of the war, the Hs-129 was remembered less for victories than for what it attempted. It was a response to a specific moment, a machine built to solve a problem that had already grown larger than any single solution. Which leaves the final question not about how the aircraft performed, but about what its story reveals when viewed. From the distance of history, the Henschel Hs-129 stands as a testament to wartime invention pushed to its extremes. It was never elegant, never fast, and often perilously vulnerable. Yet it embodied a singular clarity of purpose, to bring fire directly to enemy armor from the sky. In that sense, it was brutally honest about the realities of war. Its story is a lesson in compromise. Protection sacrificed speed. Firepower demanded stability. Pilots faced near impossible odds, and every mission weighed human skill against mechanical limits. The aircraft could kill tanks, but it could not change the trajectory of a war defined by numbers, industrial capacity, and strategic depth. And yet, for all its flaws, the Hs-129 mattered. It forced planners, engineers, and pilots to confront the limits of air-to-ground warfare. It accelerated thinking about armored attack, pilot survival, and weapon integration. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, it demonstrated that ideas, even imperfect ones, could alter the battlefield in small but meaningful ways. Its legacy stretches beyond the war. Modern attack aircraft, the A-10 Warthog, the Su-25 Frogfoot carrier lessons first tested in the cold, low skies over Russia, prioritize survivability, match weapon to role, and accept that precision often comes at great cost. The Hs-129 was a flying paradox, fragile yet deadly, slow yet purposeful, marginal in strategic effect yet central in tactical imagination. Its story reminds us that in war, necessity drives invention, and that even the most flawed machines can leave a mark on history. Not through perfection, but through daring, adaptation, and human endurance. The frozen plains, the roar of engines, the crack of cannon fire, they endure in memory, echoing the courage and cost of those who dared to fly a flying anti-tank gun.